So my name is Andrew Wender, and I am the director of the University of Victoria's Religion, Culture, and Society program. And in collaboration with our friends and colleagues at the Center for Studies in Religion and Society, I have the privilege of being the person who opens this afternoon's lecture, featuring Dr. Titus Hjelm from the University of Helsinki, who is here as the Lansdowne Lecture, a distinguished speaker series in collaboration between Religion, Culture, and Society and the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. As is customary at the University of Victoria, I'd like to open with a territorial acknowledgement before giving a further word of welcome to Dr. Hjelm. We acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So the Lansdowne series is, as I say, a distinguished series which, in the instance of the Religion, Culture, and Society program, makes it possible for scholars to visit UVic and interact with the community and with students in ways that wouldn't otherwise be feasible. And from the standpoint of RCS, we'd like to issue a special gratitude to the Office of the Dean of Humanities for helping to make it possible for us to have this opportunity. For us to visit with Dr. Hjelm, who is, I think you will find, in fact, I know you will find, after the privilege of spending some days with him this week, an extraordinarily innovative and, above all, really, really nice scholar of religion. When colleagues in RCS and the CSRS we're talking about the possibility of reaching out to Dr. Hjelm to see if it might be possible for him to come in the context of this series. It was repeated time and again. This is a brilliant person and a lovely person, and both are indeed true. So Dr. Hjelm has a voluminous CV. I won't go into the details, but just to indicate that among his most recent publications are Peter L. Berger on religion, The Social Reality of Religion with Routledge, so a work on an eminent sociologist of religion, which is a particular angle on the study of religion that is very much in Dr. Hjelm's wheelhouse. Further in that connection, he's also editor-in-chief of the journal Sociology of Religion, a major Oxford University Press journal. The last thing I'll say is, it surely is indicative of an innovative scholar and just person out in the world that Titus has a Wikipedia page. And when you look him up on Wikipedia, the fact that he is a member of a very well-known band actually appears before the fact that he is a scholar of religion. And so both will come into the equation this afternoon as he speaks on religion and spirituality are not something we have or do not have. They are something we do. And so the last thing I'll say before we open the evening's proceedings is that, as is customary for CSRS lectures, our guest will speak for up to about 40 minutes, followed by about 15 to 20 minutes for questions and discussion. And that will be moderated by my colleague and friend, Dr. Paul Bramadat, director of the CSRS. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yep, good. Thank you so much, Andrew, for the kind words, and to all of the organizers for inviting me. I truly feel the weight of responsibility on my shoulders right now, more than I usually do when giving lectures on topics that I've been talking about quite a lot in recent years. And thank you everyone for coming and on site and online. I was hoping that I would be able to tell you how I've enjoyed the 3 days here in your lovely city, but unfortunately I've been in bed for 3 days with a fever. I have a great view from my hotel room, but it's not quite the same. I'm really banking on that being very nice rather than being innovative today, because I feel like my mind is somewhere, I don't know where it is, but So yeah, like 5 minutes before I left the room today, I was feeling like none of this makes any sense. But the silver lining is that whatever silliness comes out of my mouth, I can blame it on the cocktail of painkillers that I just had before I came here. About today, what I want to talk about today, maybe it's my kind of school teacher background or something, but I've never been very keen on sort of dumping information on people. So which is very common in academic events, like, here's my research, these are the results, and blah, 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 and so forth. I'm sort of much more interested in figuring out how to better understand the world around us. I mean, that's obviously what we're doing here, all of us, and having that doing that research, having that information is part of it, but maybe more importantly, how to interpret that data and that information. And this is something that I'm trying to do today as well, is to kind of how to think about this phenomenon we call religion or spirituality. And my main point is that we're not maybe thinking about it very well all the time. And I'll just say briefly what the main point is. It's indicated by the title, but what I'll do today is to suggest that I think the main culprit here, the problem we have in talking about religion, and not just in academia, but in everyday life as well, is what we could call this like a possessive view of religion, that religion is something that we possess, we have it or we don't have it. We are religious or secular, or we have a little bit of it, or we have a lot of it, or we're maybe completely religiously infused fundamentalists, as we used to say, in the 90s and early 2000s. So what I want to do today is to consider how and why that often doesn't help to understand what religion and spirituality are about. And when I was thinking of this thing, I mean, we had some discussions with the organizers that what they would like to hear about. And I don't know whether it's a good or a bad thing, but this kind of, as you heard from Andrew, that I have this history in another profession as well. And sometimes it's a blessing, sometimes it's a curse. And so tonight I'm going to talk about 3 M's. This was a lucky strike that they ended up being 3 M's. But I'm going to talk about metal music, which is this is my other profession. And then I'm going to talk about very little about mindfulness, and then migration. And these are actually not, apart from metal music to some extent, these are not actually things that I study myself. So I'm also taking this opportunity to actually showcase the work that's been done in Helsinki by recent PhDs and my current PhD students. And I hope I'm doing them justice by cannibalizing their work in order to make a point, which I do think they agree with me on, but are working on slightly different things. And of course, all the silliness that remains is my fault alone. Right. I said to Andrew earlier this week when we first met that even though I'm very skeptical of all kinds of national stereotypes, actually I think I'm a sociologist of religion most of all, and I think the job of sociology is in many ways to deconstruct all kinds of stereotypes, to figure out how did we come to think of things as we think about them. But I do think there's one stereotype about Finns especially that is true, and that is the fact that we're very bad at taking praise. So as Andrew was talking, I was like, oh no, that's nothing, that's how we do it. But I'll start by with a topic that I am admittedly the world expert on, and that is myself. This is a picture of the cover of an album that came out in 1997, so some time ago, by a Finnish metal band, Hjelm. The word hymn actually comes from 3, originally they were called something else, but then they were kind of shortened to him, but originally it meant His Infernal Majesty. And there are two reasons why this album is the reason why I'm here today. One of them is quite literally is that I played in this band for a while in the early 90s. And they actually became quite big. They were in the Billboard Top 20, the actual Top 20, not just the rock and metal charts and so forth. And they've been touring around the world. They've now been defunct for about, I don't know, 8 years or something. But so they were living the rock and roll lifestyle and all that, and big hits all over the world. So had fate had something else in store, I would have been touring the world, living, trashing hotel rooms, living the rock star life. But then that, of course, would have meant that I wouldn't have had the time to think about all the things that I'm going to talk about today. No regrets there. The more kind of a roundabout way how this album is the reason why I'm here is that him became quite famous in Finland first, and then elsewhere in Europe, and then in the US and North America quite quickly. And they were performing at this one big festival in Finland with some other luminaries of the genre, like Black Sabbath, who are the kind of godfathers of metal music, and Norwegian black metal band Dimmu Borgir. And the interesting thing about that festival was that the local newspapers and then the national newspapers started writing about that. The locals were very concerned that the town would be overrun by Satanists because these three bands were playing at that festival. Now, having known these guys, these are my mates. I've known them since school, childhood. I actually know the keyboard player since I was 2 days old, because our mothers were best friends and we were born 2 days apart. So I know them quite well, and I know that they are as Satanists, as Satanist as the other great Finnish export, the Moomins. Or if you don't know what the Moomins are, let's say Mickey Mouse, but that's what I'm getting at here. So this was at the time when I was thinking about what I'm going to do with my MA dissertation in the study of religion, or religious studies in Helsinki, to kind of try to figure out what's going on here. I know these people are not Satanists, yet they are talked about as Satanists, and people are actually really concerned that, something bad is going to happen when these guys are coming to play in their town. And I really wanted to know, especially in the beginning of my career, that why did the media go along with this kind of concern, and why did they report it without much questioning why there would be reason to be concerned about a metal band like him. And that ended up being my MA dissertation, and then I extended it more or less to my PhD, and that's how I came to be here today. So that's the origin story, so to say. But then to kind of figure out some answers to the questions, like why would they be part of this, what could be called a kind of a satanic panic, as some fellow scholars in the US have called it. I mean, obviously, let's start with the symbolism. Not everyone knew at the time that him is short for His Infernal Majesty, but that's a kind of a hint. There's a hint there. The album, you can't probably see it, but the album is called Greatest Love Songs, Volume 666. And that, if you know your Bible, is the number of the beast, of course. And later on, they came up with this, I think, ingenious logo for the band. They call it the heartogram. So it's a pentagram, but with a twist. And they actually call their genre love metal. And here is the first question mark to me, okay, there are all these trappings of Satanism. They didn't use the inverted crosses like Black Sabbath did and Dimmu Borgir did and so forth. But the other ones, the pentagram and so forth. But love metal, how satanic is that? So, but anyway, the trappings were there. And And of course, we have to put this into context, what was happening in the early 90s, especially in Norway, which was close to Finland. Of course, we were following things in Norway quite closely. This is the originally medieval reconstructed Fantoft, what they call a stave church, a wooden church that was burned down in 1993, two, as it says. Apparently, and I think actually we know that it was lit by a member of a Norwegian black metal band in Bergen, Norway. And there were other things happening in the scene. The black metal scene guys, they killed themselves, they killed each other, and they killed some innocent bystanders as well. So lots of bad things happening there, and not very nice guys, all of them. But the question is that, does Satanism help us understand what was going on? And especially, I think, going back to him, whom, again, I remind you, I know they are as Satanist as the movements. Does the use of these symbols implicate everyone as Satanist who uses them? And how useful is that? Now, as a kind of a practicing musician, I had obviously my own opinions about this, but my opinions are not very important when you try to figure out things academically. But we did try to do that then later on with two colleagues of mine, Heath Khan Harris and Mark Levine, in this book that we edited in 2013. And in that book and other places where I've tried to talk about heavy metal and its connections, especially with Satanism, I've tried to kind of sort of remind general audiences, but also scholars of religion, that sometimes it's part of our toolkit to be able to say that when religion is perhaps not the best way to understand what's going on with the phenomenon. So what I've been saying is that this kind of satanic symbolism for a lot of these bands, and particularly, I mean, specifically for someone like him, is much more about a kind of a generic identification. And by that, I mean that the trappings that you take, whether the inverted crosses, the pentagrams, and so forth, are a way to identify that we are part of this genre and not some other genre, and people recognize us for it. And this is not a very revolutionary thought. I mean, you know, you look at country music, they have their trappings, they have the Stetsons, they have the big cars. You know, hip hop, rap has, you know, the gold chains, the sneakers, what have you. I mean, there's actually, I think, quite a mundane explanation to some of these things, and not just sort of the identification with what other bands do, but popular culture more broadly. So, I mean, horror films have been an inspiration for a lot of metal bands as well. And of course, horror films have this kind of, you know, a lot of this religious horror is a sort of a subgenre of that. And why they do this? The point, of course, has always been to shock. And it has worked. We know from the 80s, especially in the US, that we had these satanic panics, as I mentioned, that people were really concerned about Satanists kidnapping their daughters and so forth. But in hindsight, I think what best captures this phenomenon is what Gordon Melton, who can be described as this kind of encyclopedist of American religion, said already several years ago now, said something along the lines that Satanism is the world's largest religion that never existed. And I think that summarizes this brilliantly, in the sense that there was a lot of concern about Satanism, but people had quite a hard time actually finding the Satanists. Those people would kind of raise their hand if you're a Satanist kind of people. But what did happen, and what I think is a much sort of sensible and useful way of looking at this phenomenon and interpreting it, is that what sociologists call secondary deviation. And by that, I mean that people who are labeled as something, in this case, Satanists, those people actually appropriate that label and start using it and sort of like playing along the rules of the game set by someone else. And if the point is to shock, and if it works, then why not go along with it? Sometimes it might be just playful, and okay, we're Satanists and boo, and we'll scratch an inverted cross on the church wall, and that's unfortunate and not so nice, but not too bad. Sometimes it leads to worse things like what we know in Norway. Now, I don't really have time to go into this much, but I'll just show you a glimpse of what my PhD student Paki Ekeström is doing in Helsinki about metal music, and especially sort of extreme metal music in Iran and Saudi Arabia in a quite different context. So, I mean, in the West, we have been worried about the kind of the inverted Christian symbols and the kind of satanic imagery, which comes, I would say, as much from popular culture as it does from actual sort of Christian or even less Satanist sources. But here's a very shortly an interesting case of the Iranian band Confess, who were actually sentenced, were given prison sentences and lashes for releasing this. I think this was the EP, and this was the cover of it. They later fled Iran and now live in Norway. But the point here that what made this blasphemous in Iran was not the religious symbols associated with evil, but actually the most secular symbol you might have, which is the necktie. And the fact that it's associated with the headgear that is usually associated with religious specialists in the country. That there's the great Satan of Western sort of, businessman attire, and then the religious symbol in the head, on the head. We can talk about that more in the Q&A. I have to move forward, but just putting this up there as an example of how context matters, what religion becomes, what bad religion becomes, or irreligion becomes in different contexts. Now, moving on, now we are also certainly moving on to something that I'm on very much a shaky ground in the sense that this is not something that I've done much in my own research, but I've read this research by Ville Husgavel, who defended his PhD 2 years ago, if I remember right now. And much of the research, it's an article-based dissertation or thesis, and much of it has to do with tracking the genealogy of modern-day mindfulness and the Buddhist influences in modern-day mindfulness. That part I wasn't that interested in, but what was interesting for the purposes of today's talk is one case study in that thesis where Ville did sort of this ethnography of mindfulness teacher training course. Actually, it was more of like an auto-ethnography because he was a participant on that course, but also analyzed the interaction there. And the interesting thing there that he was looking at, and for my purposes, the interesting things that he found was this, he was trying to figure out, after having figured out from a sort of a more historical, maybe even normative way, like how the Buddhist influences on modern day mindfulness, then looking at how does that play out in the kind of live setting, lived practice of mindfulness, and especially the socialization of new teachers, mindfulness teachers. And it didn't figure out barely at all. I mean, there were some references, kind of symbolic references to Buddhist poetry, for example, and maybe somebody who raised the issue, then there could be discussion with the teacher about that. But otherwise, Buddhism was pretty much sort of absent. And so there's an interesting kind of a tension there, that on the one hand, he's identifying that there are Buddhist influences in modern day mindfulness, but then they are not really discussed when people get together to talk about what mindfulness is. Now, of course, the question here is if we take this kind of possessive view of religion, like, do we have it or do we not have it, then mindfulness is really a problematic issue. The answer to is mindfulness religious, for example? If that's the question, the answer is always going to be yes and no. And that's not a very good academic answer. The interesting thing that Ville kind of discovered and sort of found in this is about how that is negotiated. And how in different, when the dynamics are different, the teacher might offer like, yeah, okay, there is this and that, and some of the students might have an idea, and mindfulness being kind of an open tradition. This, I guess, sort of from a sociological point of view, is the point of spirituality, is that it's much more open than what we traditionally talk about as religion. That it's, it's open-ended in the sense that there's more room for variety, even on an individual level. But the point was that the Buddhistness of mindfulness is an outcome of negotiations rather than that we can point to that, yeah, yes or no. Again, we can come back to that later, although I have to say that's about as far as I can elaborate that case. Finally, my PhD student Hjelm, and there's your daily dose of Finnish language, is working on a superbly interesting case. She has a unique data set of more than 200 interviews from the Finnish Immigration Service of people who apply for asylum in Finland based on religious discrimination. So the UN has several reasons that qualify you to apply for asylum, and religion is one of them. Religious discrimination is one of them. So in her cases, there are cases of Shia Muslims coming from Sunni majority areas applying for asylum. The other way around, people who have converted to Christianity, either in the country of origin, in a Muslim majority country of origin, or in Finland while waiting for their process to proceed. And then there are also some Russian Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, let me just show you an excerpt. This is translated by Hjelm herself, of what's going on in here. And I have to actually look at the screen from here because I can't see anything from that little one. So I'm going to read this, so the questioner, the interviewer, how is Christianity present in your life outside this congregation? Well, it's present through love for other people. I'm not pessimistic, I just feel happy and I think it's only natural. Question, how do you practice your religion outside church events? I practice good manners. I'm honest, my life is filled with good deeds. Have you concretely changed something in your behavior or everyday life since your conversion to Christianity? I stopped using alcohol. Then there's a little bit of a break. How has your family life changed? There used to be some bickering, but since Christianity, we tolerate each other better. Question, do you do something related to Christianity as a family outside church events? What do you mean exactly? How do you practice Christianity other than going to church events? As I told you in the beginning, we practice good deeds and good habits. Now, some of you are maybe seeing a pattern here, and it becomes even more obvious when you see the decision text. So Hjelm also had access to these interviews and also the decisions that the Immigration Service then did. I'm not going to read all of this. It's basically just repeating what the applicant has said before, but the interesting thing is the last sentence. Based on your coherent narratives, the Immigration Service accepts as a fact that going to church and participation in congregation events have had a calming effect on your family life. However, your narratives do not show how Christianity itself has influenced this change. Now, clearly, if you go back to this, the interview interaction, the interviewer was clearly pushing for something that they were not getting outside of the congregation, outside of church events, outside church events again, other than going to church events. And the key to this is in the other sentence, just before the break there. When asked separately, you have also mentioned praying and reading the Bible. So that is probably what the interviewer wanted to hear, that the person also reads the Bible and prays, either alone or with the family. It was not forthcoming in the interviews. For the interviewed person, religion was about morality. It changed the way I, live and treat my, fellow people. But for the interviewer, authentic religion is, authentic conversion to Christianity means reading the Bible and praying. And they were not getting that answer. And what makes it worse is that it says, when asked separately. So only after prompted, they did say that, yes, I actually do those things as well. But that kind of is actually a bad thing when they had to ask separately about that. So the authenticity of that conversion is being questioned here. Right. I should have done this in 20 minutes. I'm like 26, but here we go. This is just a generic pause picture to not to leave Hjelm's text there for the rest of the talk. So what does this all mean then? What's the point of talking about these different things? Now, let's go back to my initial statement that I find the possessive view of religion and spirituality problematic, and look at some of these cases again. I did say some of these things already, but to repeat. Is it useful for us to ask about metal musicians and metal fans? Are they Satanists? Some probably are. That's fine. But many, actually, I would say most, are not. So it's a yes and no situation once again. So how does Satanism then help understand the phenomenon? Whether I mean by that the music that's being put out, the imagery, or the actions that the fans and the bands do. I don't think it really does help understand that. Instead, I think we should look at how the image, those religious symbols, are being appropriated in order to gain more kind of subcultural capital. And also to remind you that I think that it's useful to think of this phenomenon in terms of the reaction to that phenomenon, creating another reaction, which kind of intensifies, which appropriates the reaction itself, so that people who are being labeled as Satanists actually take on that identity, not necessarily in a very deep or kind of religious way, but in the sense that, okay, this works. I'm going to use this to shock you even more if you are so concerned about it. Mindfulness, is it religious or not? I think that's the wrong question. Or again, we can ask that question, of course, but then we end up with yes and no again. So not very useful. In every religious community or spiritual community or whatever, practitioners will disagree about what is, right and what is wrong. And that is not a problem for outside observers and scholars for us, especially. That is data. And that, I think, that's exactly where I think the interesting thing happens. When people disagree, where do they go with that? That's the negotiation part of it. And that, I think, is exactly at the heart of this idea that religion is not something that people just possess, have, or do not have, but they negotiate about all the time. And again, migration. Is it authentic Christianity or not? Obviously, the law demands that the people who interview these asylum seekers, they have to make this decision. And that's what they're required to do. For us, it's data about this. This is what one person says their religion is, but this is what the other person says that it should be. So they're negotiating. Although, as I'll say in a minute, negotiation is maybe not the best word for that. But to separate religion into a sphere of its own, like was sort of done here, which is disconnected from ethnicity, morality, family, is already an example of drawing boundaries around what religion really means. Now, the implications. I mean, some of my colleagues, esteemed colleagues, claims that humans are neurologically wired for religion, that religion or spirituality resides ultimately in the brain, for example. Quite a few other colleagues have less explicit but equally essentialist ideas about religion. That is, that humans will always need religion because religion fulfills psychological or social functions that no other thing does. And I'm all fine with that. Yet, as I hope to have shown, it's an empirical fact that religion and spirituality are not just something we have, but that they are constantly becoming. We make religion and spirituality together, and that is where, to me, the interesting stuff is. Two things. First of all, this is not a very novel argument at all. Actually, people have been talking about this for some time. And secondly, I'm not claiming that this is the only way that we should be looking at religion, but I do think we need kind of, this possessive view in some ways, because methodologically, this is a different kind of approach. But if we don't think of religion as something that we actually do and create in interaction, then we are missing out on quite a bit of what's interesting in what we call religion and spirituality. One thing that I would add, speaking of that negotiation, is the issue of power, which I'm also been interested in all my academic life. If we take these kind of interactional constructions of religion as our focus, we have to acknowledge that not all constructions are equal. The migration interview is the most obvious example. The power is not equally shared. The interviewer has all the power. I mean, Hjelm could maybe tell you otherwise, but I remember from reading her work that I don't remember a single case where the interviewer might have changed their view of what's going on based on what the interviewed person was saying. It was rather all that the kind of implicit definition of religion was almost always imposed on the person interviewed. And that is why I think we can't just settle with the possessive view of religion, that we need to look at these things, how religion becomes something in particular types of interaction. I will just use these last minutes to say a couple of things connected to my own research and sort of ideas that where I would like to take this in terms of how to apply this to things that interest me. I'm not sure how I'm going to do that in 5 minutes, because this is where I drop my notes and start just sort of foaming at the mouth, because I'm really interested in these things. One of them is secularization, and the other is religious literacy. I'll just try to be very brief with the secularization. So far, secularization broadly means the decline of the influence of religion in society. And so far, sociologists of religion have thought about it in two levels. First, there's the institutional level, which basically claims that religion has evacuated other social spheres of life, like law, politics, education, health, welfare, you name it. That these things are done without reference to religion. And obviously, Iran is not a good case of secularization. Religion is implicated in all parts of the law, for example. But then, we compare that to France, for example, and then we can see how that works. And then there's the other level, the individual level, which we measure by looking at different variables, usually asking, about membership of religious communities, then asking about people's beliefs and practices, and then asking about people's self-identification. And from the kind of Western data, we can see that all of these have come down in different sort of, measures. Membership has come down much faster than the other two, but the pattern is quite clear. Now, what are we missing when we are talking about religion as something that institutions or individuals either have or don't have? Okay, so the courts are secular because they don't take religious justifications into account. People are secular if they don't go to church, if they're not members, and if they don't identify as such. I think we're missing the kind of the middle level, the part where people kind of, regardless of whether they possess religion or not, act in certain ways, which tells us something about the role of religion and spirituality in society more broadly. So I'm just thinking an example, like a good American friend of mine. This must have been in Europe, because that would explain my reaction better. But we were having dinner, and just before her meal, she started praying. She's a devout Christian. I knew that. But I was sort of, when she started doing this, I was going like, is everyone staring at us? Because that's how I felt like, I knew what she was doing, but it felt so inappropriate. Another example from my other project about religion and politics is that we have some, especially in the Christian Democratic Party in Finland, we have some politicians that are very vocal about their religiosity when giving, media interviews and so forth. But then when we look at how they justify their political choices in the parliament, they almost never use religious language. Take a case like abortion, for example, which is a sort of a prime example of kind of social controversies where religion is implicated. The best known anti-abortion MP in Finland almost never mentions the Bible, for example, when it comes to abortion. She refers to medical arguments and so forth. And to us, and to me, and the research team, that I think is an indication of the secularity of that institution, in the sense that no matter what your individual level possession of religion or not, it's not appropriate or not even sort of like intelligible to start justifying your political actions with religion. So I think we need this kind of middle level, interactional level, if we want to talk about secularization, because we look at either the institutional separation or the individual level, and we get one picture, but we don't get the whole picture. And I think that's why we kind of need to let go again of the possessive view of religion. I really don't have any time, but I'll just mention very, very briefly religious literacy, because that's something else that I'm interested in. Religious literacy is sort of this like a fad concept that is about, that if we know more about religion and especially religious traditions, then we could be better citizens and live in harmony with different kinds of worldviews and religious diversity and so forth. There are other more elaborate definitions than that. But of course, now that kind of the implied idea there is that once you have more knowledge, you become more tolerant, and then we will all be better citizens. And knowledge, especially about the content of religion, that's what's often sort of talked about. Now, I'm a bit sort of skeptical about that. I'm not sure that any amount of learning about the Quran or the 5 pillars of Islam will help or make a person more accepting of their fellow Muslims, especially if they are prejudiced to begin with. And some of the literature of religious literacy does talk about the importance of context, but I think that needs to be elaborated, because it kind of, if we take this kind of religion as doing approach, then it complicates things quite a lot, because it doesn't help us to know what the Quran says something. What we need to know is how people actually there and then think about that, what the Quran says. So actually, I would go about religious literacy in the other way around. I would start with deconstructing our prejudices about other religions and thinking about, or worldviews in general, and then to think about where do those prejudices, where do those stereotypes come from? And maybe then we could get somewhere with learning about the contents of different worldviews as well, when we start understanding where we come from. But that's not often the point. there. Now, I'm truly sorry, but I'll just circle back to the beginning for 1 more minute. So that's really what I wanted to say in terms of the point that I wanted to drive across. I'm not sure if I did make any sense, but let's hope so. But I wanted to share you with one more thing, which is relevant to what I've been talking about today. So I come from a family of completely religiously tone deaf people. I mean, in several generations. So when I started studying religion at university, they were confused. My mother was a great cusser. She would smoke a cigarette inside, read the newspaper, and start cursing whenever she read something about, contemporary politics or something like that. And this would be a ritual that we would go to our grandparents' place, and she would sit down, take the newspaper, start smoking, and start those bloody whatever. And then my grandmother suddenly, after I started studies at university, was like, "Oh no, you can't curse anymore. Titus studies religion at university now." And I was like, "What?" And maybe other scholars of religion have had the same experience also with friends. I mean, new friends or even old friends. That when they're, "Oh, so what do you study?" "I study religion." They're like, "Oh, are you religious?" I'm like, no, I'm just interested in it as a social institution, blah, 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 blah. And, things got so much weirder when I, started doing my PhD. And they were like, "Oh, so what are you researching?" "Satanism." "Oh, are you?" And I got so tired of explaining. So I was like, "What did you think?" Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, Titus. That was as good as I knew it would be. Thanks very much. So now we have about 15 minutes or so for some conversation. Scott's got a mic. He'll take it around to you if you just raise your hand.
I'm going to resist asking a question about the metal part.
Yeah.
Because we talked quite a bit about it, and it was in my class. So, but I have a question about the immigration example that you talked about, and it's something that I've thought about when Paul talks about some of the work he does. And we have, as scholars of religion, kind of our debates about what defines religion and our ideas of it, but often our ideas can negatively affect, like if we say a certain thing is not religious, then somebody claiming asylum who is claiming it based on that thing being a religion could be denied asylum. So how do we negotiate kind of our scholarly ideas about what is religion and kind of real world need to kind of maintain a fiction perhaps of something being religion? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Do we do one at a time?
It's a useful fiction. Yeah, please.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a great question. And I think often when I talk about this idea that, we need to look at religion as a construction, as something that we do together. And often it happens, obviously, through discourse, the way we talk about things. And then, well, it's just, you just study talk. And I'm like, take Hjelm's work and you can see literally how talk is a life and death question. Yeah. Where we end up with that one interview can mean deportation and possibly, death for that person. So it's not just talk. It is talk, but it has like very serious consequences. Sometimes it can be playful, as with the metal example, for example. But I think Hjelm's work is also methodologically really important because it shows that, talk is never just talk. I think there are two ways of going about this. One is like, taking the critical road in the sense that we're kind of deconstructing, exposing, like, okay, this is how you do it. And there's a problem there, like I've been trying to show that, okay, the interviewers are pushing one view of religion on the people interviewed that have another view. But then the next step, of course, is the question, should we take the next step saying that, okay, that is religion or that is not religion? And that's where your point comes across. Like, where do we stand in this? Are we there to arbitrate? Because in some cases it might, there was a case in Finland. In Finland, you can, you don't have to, but you can register as an officially recognized religious community. It brings you some, it's not a kind of a tax exempt thing like in the US, but it brings you some advantages. But mostly it's about kind of seeming legitimate in the eyes of the broader public. And there have been some interesting patterns where some sort of, especially sort of pagan groups, have been denied this registration. And so then some sort of scholars have stepped in saying that, okay, this is not cool, especially like, when we know that the reasons for that denial have often been associated with the idea that the church is the model of religion and the rest is sort of like have to follow that. But that's I don't have an answer to that. I think we can show the kind of the problems, but whether we should kind of stand in and kind of start adjudicating, like what is real religion or not, I think I would be quite hesitant to, even though I think we need to be there outside of our chambers to be there out there in the world. But that really is a problem. I think awareness of the constructedness of the word religion is something to begin with. For people to understand that religion is actually made in these interactions maybe might help.
Thank you. Martin. Wait, just got it. Mike.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. So I wondered if we could tease out a little bit more of your analysis and your approach to this question of, where the designation religion originates. And when I hear your talk, I think, well, we've got the individual and his own self-understanding, or you mentioned at one point self-identification. And then on the other hand, you have society at large who attributes the designation or labels someone religious. And I wonder how much weight you give to the individual self-understanding in terms of their own behavior. The one person you were talking about who was a Christian saw it in terms of their good and bad moral conduct. And in this regard, before I give you back the mic and let you respond, I'll just tell you a funny anecdote from my own personal history, which sort of brings this out. I studied Buddhism as an undergraduate, and afterwards, long after I finished that undergraduate degree, I did a meditation course. And I went back to my professor afterwards, and I said, now I finally understand what it is you were talking about all those years ago. And he goes, so are you a Buddhist? And I said, well, in one sense, yes, but in another sense, no. And he said, there, you are a Buddhist.
Is that Victor?
So what do you think about this? Where does it originate? Like, doesn't the individual's own self-understanding sort of trump, let me put it in that kind of way, trump the societal labeling?
Yeah. I guess there are two things there. Like, do I think methodologically it should, or does it actually? And methodologically, I'm not so sure. I think all these cases show that I mean, one of the things that I don't like about spirituality as a term is this idea that we are solipsistic and we just sort of pull together influences from everywhere, but then we put it together ourselves. This kind of Robert Bellah Sheilaism idea. I don't think kind of Sheila really exists. It's always done in interaction with not necessarily even other people. It might be in the interaction with a web page, in interaction with a book you read or something like that. But we're always getting these. The way we construct the self, I think, is always dependent on other people and other discourses as well. So there's that. Then whether it actually does, I think, all depends on the issue of power. I mean, I guess that's exactly the point of the example. That okay, this person self-identification is that I'm a good Christian because I do good things. But in that context, in that situation where the interaction is defined by a huge power discrepancy, then it really doesn't. And like I said, I mean, the metal case is another interesting one in the sense that, you know, the newspapers label somebody a Satanist. What I think a lot of metal bands went and did was that they ironically appropriated that. So they kind of inverted the, you know, the newspapers have this power of labeling whole groups of people who happen to dress in particular ways. I think they kind of ironically appropriated it and turned it against them. And it worked. But in some cases, it didn't. I mean, we have cases in Finland, for example, where a high school student was sent back home because he was wearing a black metal band T-shirt, which, you know, to me is like not a great thing. But I'm not sure if I answered your question really, but
right territory. It's very tricky territory. We're talking about intersubjective communications, attributions, mimicry.
Yeah.
You know, and so this conversation.
Yeah.
We can go on maybe at dinner, but it's almost as a methodological observation. This is a classic philosophical question answered by a sociologist. Right? So that there's a bit of like it's like a Spanish person talking to a Portuguese person.
Yeah, halfway through the answer, I was feeling stupid. You know?
That's how we design the questions.
Yeah.
Hey, Reina.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I wanted to continue the conversation about metal, specifically in what you were just talking about, how black metal and Satanism, those two together, usually defy Protestant understandings of who is religious, what is a religious act, and how to sort people into Satanism or not. And I was wondering from your experience in the metal scene, this kind of question about normative understandings of who is religious. Do those norms get pushed in spaces that are usually associated with transgression? So we're talking about metal, but like also other places that are associated with transgression.
Like, can you give me an example of maybe?
Like an example that comes to mind is in my third year, I took a religion and sexuality class, and we talked about sex work done in religious spaces in India. And that's another space where I think about kind of the categories of what is a religiously pure act or not gets blurred or is operating in a different understanding than what Protestant scholars come into it with.
Yes. Okay, now I get it. Yeah. So, yeah, right. So that's a very good question. I feel like I'm being exposed here, but no, but it's right, because I mean, obviously, sort of when we talk about religion or religiosity in this case and here, I'm mainly sort of, when I say that, you know, I don't know if it's useful to speak of them as religious people, I kind of mean it in the, you know, traditional Protestant sense that, you know, it has certain, you know, features that make it a religion. But of course, then, you know, we have this other approach to religion, which would be more like, you know, how does it affect people? You know, lots of my colleagues talk about black metal concerts, for example, as rituals, as something that they go to experience, something that could be called religion. I'm fine with that. I just usually don't go there because I find this kind of functional definition of religion quite problematic, because then I don't know really what is not religion anymore. Because anything can be religion. That's sort of my problem. Because to me, the interesting thing is these negotiations, these boundaries, these boundary markings. You know, like, is this religion? Is this secular? Is this a little bit religious? Is this a lot religious, and so forth? You know, and it doesn't really actually have to. It doesn't have to matter to me at all if they are really religious or not. It's the negotiation part that's interesting from this perspective that I'm trying to sell here. The problem is that if we take anything, event or something that can lead to similar kinds of experiences as, you know, that could be considered religious, then I don't know where that boundary is anymore, kind of. Does it make sense? Hopefully.
Do you find
Here, let me give you this.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, do you find that questioning happens more in minority power spaces or in majority power spaces?
like in general, or having to do with metal particularly?
I would say in general.
That's a good question as well. I don't know if I have an answer for you right now. I mean, obviously, the point, I'm very interested in questions of legitimacy. You know, what is a legitimate religion? Not as the judge of that, but as the observer of those negotiations. And of course, when you're in a minority space, that is something that you have to think about much more than in a majority space, because you kind of take for granted some of these things. And this is an interesting change, for example. Just I don't want to talk about kind of Finnish society and culture is not very interesting for you intrinsically, I'm sure. But you know, the change in the Nordic countries where the big state churches, the membership has come down. When I was born 50 years ago, Finland was at like 95% or something for members. Now it's 63%. Sweden is down to 50 probably this year or next year. How does the legitimacy change when you go below that kind of democratic 50% level? So far, it's been a kind of taken for granted thing. You know, the Lutherans don't have to do all those things that Muslims in Finland, for example, have to do to show that they're good citizens and that their religion is actually a good religion. It's taken for granted. So in that sense, I think, yeah, minority spaces, that kind of, you know, negotiation happens much more.
So thanks very much. Thanks. That was a great question. And maybe you can come to coffee tomorrow and we can tease it out a bit more. I'm going to just take advantage of my role as chair here to ask one last question, which you can answer in a pithy sort of way, because I've known Titus a long time and I'm so happy to have a friend as well as a colleague here. The question is really about religion and spirituality. Do you find that religion is more, that the category of religion is used in public discourse and intellectual discourse is more indicative of this problem that you're identifying, the possessive definition, than spirituality is, right? Because many people would say, well, you know what, the whole category of religion is very problematic. It's very 19th century. It's all, you know, wrapped up with colonialism. But the cleaner category is spirituality, and people feel often a sense of relief when that category is introduced as a juxtaposition or as an alternative to religion. But I sense you feel that both categories are problematic and defined possessively.
I'll start by being honest. First of all, I added spirituality to the title because of you, and
My bad.
and because I know you were going to be here. But as I kind of, I mean, I should have said in the beginning that I kind of talk about religion almost all the time, even though I had spirituality up there, and I haven't still figured quite out myself, you know, how they are useful in different ways. And like I said, I also don't necessarily like that spirituality that much, at least in the ways that it has been sometimes used as this kind of like, you know, open-ended free-for-all thing, although it has those aspects, but it's not completely absent from those negotiations that we have. Right. But I think where the difference is the nature of those negotiations, I think. So probably spirituality has so far gotten maybe a bit of a free pass compared to religion. Yeah. And also because this idea that spirituality is maybe not so institutionalized, it doesn't have to deal with the same kind of, say, legal, you know, boundaries that if you want to be a recognized religion, they have to do and so forth. So I think it kind of, as methodologically, I think they can be in the same box because it's all about these negotiations. It's all about how they're being constructed and done. So far, I think, yeah, I think you're right. Kind of spirituality has gotten off the hook a little bit more. Whether that's going to be the case in the future, I don't know. And that's interesting. That's an interesting question.
And several of our friends and colleagues at the ISSR, the International Society of the Sociology of Religion, are kind of in the business of poking at the category of religion as a category which is often introduced to solve problems, but then creates problems. It reveals problems or complex social processes that we often think it will have resolved, right?
Yeah. And this is always the double bind of this approach, and being a scholar who's mostly interested in these negotiations and these constructions, is that like when I can just sit here and say, oh, it's all data to me. But then there are these slippages like, okay, this was the second time that I was told that, you speak of religion as a, a good old Protestant, this week. And I was like, do I? But so, I mean, I have to, so it's complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated. Thanks very much. Now,
you.
Scott, I don't want to push the wrong button to let you know what's happening next week, but please join me in thanking Titus Hjelm.
Thank you.
Titus mentioned that he's, he has about a pound of cold and flu medication on board. And so I want to really thank him for powering through this because he's visited Shamad's class and Andrew's class, and he's hanging out with us in various ways. And he's doing it really under tremendous viral duress. So thanks very much for being with us.
Adrenaline is a good drug.
Yes.